I was just telling Robert and Peg earlier that I have two. I mean, I'm very emotional because I feel like well, I'm defending my dissertation again. My whole committee is in the room, so that makes me a little bit nervous. But I'm also very happy because when I first came here as a grad student, fall '97, I was assigned as an RA to PARCC, and this conversation series, organizing this conversation series, was my job actually. and I'm happy to see that you haven't changed the place you ordered your pizza. So it's still, it's even the pizza is the same, and it's nice to see some traditions going on, and and happy to have all of you here. This is great. Right, so what I'm going to talk about today is the current research project that I'm doing at USIP. I've been there since March, and I started working on this research then. But it is based on a previous research study that I did with Tanya Pfaffenholz at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. She set up the Inclusive Peace and Transition Initiative right now, and I'm also a senior fellow there. So some of this research, the case studies, the collection of case studies was done between 2013 and 2016. We collected 40 case studies, either peace negotiations or political transition negotiations, all having some aspect of inclusion, that is, broader participation. So negotiations not just taking place between the, two representatives, but negotiations that are conducted somehow with the intention of broadening participation. So we identified 40 such cases between late 1980s, early 1990s, and of Cold War until 2015. And we studied them looking into, who was included, how was the inclusion done. We identified a number of different, this keeps coming back, sorry. We identified a number of different inclusion mechanisms. We sort of classified it, ranging from directly being at the table all the way to high-level problem-solving workshops, etc. So that research was done, and one of the things that as we were analyzing those cases was that there was a lot of resistance to inclusion that we in these cases, which came in very different forms, very different timing, very different times, etc. So I decided to look a little bit closer into that in this USIP project. I went, and I also wanted to bring a different lens, different perspective to this, trying to understand the motivation to resistance, to inclusion. What really motivates, these actors? Why do they resist? In addition to who are they targeting? Who is resisting whose inclusion? What tactics they use, and what motivates them. So this was the intention. This is the intention. This is the objective of the current research project. And it is still. I'm still working on it. My data set has been just finalized, and I'm still actually doing work on this. So this is nowhere complete, and I really look forward to hearing your input and feedback. Let me talk a little bit about the rationale, the definitions, the concepts, what I use, and then I'll present some of my preliminary findings. As you know, inclusion, especially inclusion in negotiations, and in peace processes has been rising on the policy agenda recently, with the most recent UN World Bank report, for example, from 2018, Pathways to Peace. A lot of work going on with NGOs, international NGOs at the UN, at regional organizations like OSCE, African Union, etc. So this has been rising as a top priority issue, but in a very normative way. So there are a lot of policy frameworks that are written in these organizations, how to do inclusive mediation, how to be more how to do gender inclusive mediation, et cetera, et cetera. But it's mostly normative, right? And looking into these empirical cases, the case studies, we have seen a lot of backlash to this kind of normative push coming from international organizations or international policy circles. So that was this is one of the motivating reasons, or the motivations that I have looking into the question of backlash. Why is it occurring, even though there seems to be an agreement within these policy circles about, to have more inclusive processes? Why is it not advancing further, and where is this backlash coming from? Okay, so as I said, my intention is to understand the dynamics of this resistance bidder, who is resisting, how, and why. And the data that I'm using for this is just, as I mentioned to you, I looked into these 40 IPTI cases, identified all incidences of resistance there that took place, and then I added 2 more case studies to this, Myanmar and Central African Republic. 2 cases that I have, I haven't included Philippines yet, but I will do that as well. And in not in all 40 cases, I was able to identify incidences, but in about 31 cases, I did. And the total of events, incidences that I coded that I'm looking at is 85. So 85 incidences of resistance to inclusive negotiations across 31 cases. Okay, so how do I define how do I define resistance to? Okay, maybe I should turn off my Wi-Fi, right? Then it won't do it. Just a second. On. Okay. Okay, so how do I define resistance to inclusion? Is the behavior of particular people or groups that undermine the successful design and or implementation of an inclusive peace or political transition process. And my focus is, as I said, the incidences that I coded are all behavioral expressions. It's the behavior, actually. My focus is either individual or group behavior. It changes from incidence to incidence. Okay. Now, I use I don't want to go a lot into the detail of the theoretical parts, how I define inclusion and how it is defined in the literature, etc. But mostly I'm relying on several tracks or several sort of islands of literature in social psychology. One of them is Marilyn Brewer's work on optimal distinctiveness theory. And the way she actually, this is how she sort of formulated inclusion. So the idea here is that people are motivated by 2 fundamental needs, the need for belongingness and the need for distinctiveness or uniqueness. And inclusion actually is the sort of equilibrium between these 2 fundamental needs. So we constantly seek we're motivated to seek a balance between validation and similarity with others versus uniqueness and distinctiveness or differentiation. So this is actually based on her work. What are the other options? If we're not talking about inclusion, the optimal one, right, which is defined as being treated as an insider like others and treated fairly like others, but also allowed to retain your unique value and identity within the group, as opposed to exclusion, differentiation, and assimilation. So it is a distinct concept from others, and it is, I think, important to distinguish it from assimilation or differentiation, because a lot of times what you see is being done in the name of inclusion is assimilation, for example, or differentiation, okay? This is actually this is where I'm moving. So just to give an example to this, for example, so women want to be included in peace processes, right? But they want to be included with the recognition of their distinct contributions or distinct sort of value. And if you look at the writing on women inclusion in peace negotiations, you will see that there is a demand for this. That women bringing different voices to peace processes, women making unique contributions to negotiations, etc. So it is keeping that distinctive future while being included is an important element of this. The other two literatures that I rely on a lot is the whole literature in social psychology and group status and hierarchies, and especially the social dominance theory. And I found this theoretical work that developed here very relevant to explain the motivations of resistance. And the other actually theoretical framework that is highly applicable to explaining what is going on is the procedural justice approach again. Okay, so why is, let me just say a few things about the social dominance theory in the work. I mean, I don't want to go a lot into detail on this literature, but so the idea in the social dominance theory is that the societies are hierarchically organized. Some societies are more hierarchically organized than others. And groups that are sort of called as subordinate, there are subordinate groups and there are dominant groups, right? And the groups that are disadvantaged have fewer opportunities to belong to valued groups, okay, in the society. Because these valued positions are occupied by the higher status positions or higher status groups in the society, okay. And while the dominant group receives most of the positive social and political value, like resources, political power, social status, this could be anything really, the subordinate groups, they receive mostly negative social value. And in conflict societies, we see this kind of more, visibly, like this. There's a dominant group which has excluded the subordinate group for many years, and then the conflict, and then the there is also an ideological aspect of this too, which the social dominance theory calls the hierarchy enhancing forces. Hierarchy enhancing ideology or hierarchy enhancing forces are defined as those that produce and maintain high group-based social inequality, and as opposed to hierarchy attenuating forces in the society that produce group-based equality. All right, so how is this related to this whole inclusion debate is, as I said, I'm relying a lot on this theory in explaining what motivates resistance, and I'll give some examples later on. The two cases that I'm looking into more closely is Nepal and Guatemala, for example. And in both of these cases, you have an example of these legitimizing myths that is, legitimizing myths are defined as attitudes, values, stereotypes, call it ideologies, that promote and provide justification to hierarchy between the dominant and subordinate groups. And what you see is that as an inclusive negotiation process, by bringing in these other groups in and opening up that space, little space for inclusion, you see actually this legitimizing myth or these ideologies, attitudes constantly being, performed and reinforced in that process. So you can observe that. In Nepal, for example, this ideology pretty much justifies the dominant group and its control over pretty much all institutions in the society, etc., based on a high caste sort of, they had this ideology back in, for a long time, but in 1940s, 1950s, you can even see government documents that actually list the hierarchy of different groups, okay? So you see this dynamic coming into the negotiation process when there's an attempt to make it more inclusive. And so even though with the push of these international circles, it becomes a bit inclusive, while, a little bit later, it's closed again by these sort of elites or these power holder elites that sort of try to justify this ideology. Okay. All right. So from this perspective, we can define inclusion as the degree to which a disadvantaged or subordinate group perceives they are an esteemed, equally respected member of the society through experiencing treatment that satisfies their need for belongingness and uniqueness at the same time. All right, now this is something that Kurt Lewin, a quote from Kurt Lewin. If you want to truly understand something, try to change it. This pretty much summarizes all my research, why there is all that resistance and everything. And let me move on to my preliminary findings now. Okay. So this is a little chart that I have to visualize different types of resistance, different types of incidences. So you can actually, most of my cases or most of the incidences that I identified are either taking place in the negotiation phase or the implementation, the inclusive peace processes. But you can also expand it and look at it from a more inclusive society, inclusive institutions, right? So and the idea is that, right, by creating inclusive negotiations, by opening up that space, it will transform the society slowly into a more inclusive society, inclusive institutions, etc. Now, we can disagree on this the whole day, which direction this goes, and if the arrows goes in that direction, etc. But it gives us a point to start with, and then you can. Looking into that figure, I distinguish these incidences of resistance into two. Some of them are more targeted, limited. That is, actually, they just target, for example, the participation of a specific group in the negotiation phase. Okay, it's usually the targeted ones. They usually take place either against the participation of a particular group, individuals, such as women, opposition political party, etc. Or they are limited with a particular time, like they focus on the negotiations, and then as negotiations evolve, they sort of die down in time. So Tajikistan is an example of this, for example. There was a lot of resistance to civil society participation in the negotiations, especially by the government. But then at some point, because they think that, civil society is all related to the armed groups, right? So they're bad. But then as they see that some of the civil society can be useful for the peace process, they let them in, and it's sort of that kind of resistance dies down. Now, in some other cases, I call them pervasive resistance. It's more embedded, it takes place systematically, often by the same dominant societal group, targeting the same sort of subordinate group, and during almost all of the stages of a peace process. So, and this kind of resistance relies a lot on these hierarchy-enhancing, legitimizing myths. Okay. So the one thing that I looked into is what is the behavioral map here? Like, what kind of actions, what kind of behaviors do we observe? And coding these incidences, I grouped them into three. Implicit or more elusive, more explicit, direct, or coercive. So the examples of implicit, elusive is more like, implicit bias. And this is more difficult to get from the case studies, but I'm doing some interviews with women negotiators, and a lot of the stories that they talk about is about these micro behaviors and implicit bias, etc. So I can give more examples later on if you want. The explicit direct category is interesting, and it is usually these are very explicit behaviors to take over the decision-making rules, manipulate the decision-making process within the inclusive process, or so it is actually manipulating decisions, trying to maintain control, sabotaging, etc. And coercive is actually anything that uses violence and the threat of violence. So here is a distribution of coercive versus the other. And coercive cases are in the minority. And here's a little bit more information on the types of explicit direct behavior that doesn't include violence. So I found the anthropologist James Scott, the classification that he has about the everyday forms of resistance, although he's looking into a different context and different resistance against power, etc. But a lot of the tactics and everyday resistance tactics that he talks about found them very applicable in this case. So false compliance is one. Sabotage is another one. Foot dragging, slander, humiliation, securitizing inclusion. This is not one of his categories, but let me talk a little bit about these, give you some examples. So manipulating the decision-making rules is a very common practice. And you see this in a lot of examples like, Nepal, the national dialogue in Egypt, the political transition negotiations in Fiji. What happens is basically that the power holders, they, let me just give an example from Nepal. So the peace agreement there has an sets up a constituent assembly that is tasked to write a constitution, right? And this constituent assembly is a highly inclusive one, but it failed to come up with a constitution for 2 terms, and then the country the country got into a crisis, failed to make their constitution, and then at some point this sort of dominant group, the elites of this dominant group comes into the picture, and they strike a deal behind the closed doors, excluding all others from the decision-making process, and then they say, here you go, this is a constitution, okay? And, this created a lot of uprisings and mobilization, because some of the ethnic groups in the south, like the Madhesis, they said, well, this is not what was promised to us, this was not how it was supposed to be done in the peace agreement, etc. And then they started uprisings, people died, ended with an Indian, in the blockade of India, and the country, it turned into a bigger crisis in the country. But this was actually taking over, manipulating the decision-making rules set within the inclusive process, the inclusive constituent assembly. It's an example of that. Another one is handpicking people who will be in the process. This is very common, right? I call this the false compliance, like what Scott called. So the government says, okay, yes, let's have an inclusive negotiation process. Oh, but only the people that we want can be there. Okay. Blocking the access of people to either sensitive information or to the process. Many examples of this. Neglecting the deadlines, delaying the establishment of inclusive bodies, failure to implement their decisions, etc. Foot dragging in general has been the case in Aceh, Burundi, a lot of other cases. I would like to say a little bit about securitization of inclusion, what I mean by that, and I borrow this term securitization from the IR literature. So this elite who wants to close up the space of inclusion, they sort of come up with a security threat narrative, and in a way that inclusion is threatening the security in the country, or threatening the nation, the indivisibility of nation, or whatever, something like that. It is like this is a foreign powers agenda. Trying to divide up our country, etc. So this was again another. This was again seen in Nepal, for example. After a while, look at the discussions by the higher up elite. Actually, there are a lot of references to this kind of discourse. Okay, now let's look at the targets. Who's been the target of resistance? In other words, whose participation is not wanted, right? Now, most of the time, one interesting thing here is that not always a specific group has been the target. Most of the time, about 40% of the time, the target was the process itself. So it's like, oh, we don't want this commission, or we don't want public hearings, we don't want this national dialogue, etc. So let's not have this at all, kind of. The inclusive process was targeted. After that, actually, civil society, resistance to civil society participation is common, and it has all sorts of different reasons. Women, actually, about 10% of the cases, incidences I quoted, they don't want women inclusion there. And again, like all sorts of, similar tactics, like, there's no women expert on this, or there's, in Yemen, actually, in the Yemeni national dialogue, it was really, they were targeted publicly. There was violence against women participants. This is against our culture. All these foreign powers sort of mixing up things here, and a lot of women participants of the national dialogue were targeted publicly, slandered, and some of these cases were violent. The other common category is civil society women and representatives of ethnic religious groups. Okay. All right. Who are the resistors then? Called it the locus of about close to 60%. It's governmental, it's power holders, it's the power holder elite. So it's divided up here as government, military, and political leaders. Sometimes it's actually just a strong leader, right? You see that a lot in Eritrea, for example. This has been the case. DRC Congo, this was the case, etc. So it is the leader that is actually playing that key role. Sometimes it's the military. In Myanmar, for example, they raided and they raided the political, ethnic state level political dialogues, especially in the Shan state and several other states last year in December. Even though this was part of the peace agreement, they stopped them, so they can't hold these dialogues anymore, for instance. So it's been the military. In Fiji, again, it was the military. And then all sorts of other government entities. These could be mayors, government parties, etc. So it's most of the time it comes from the power holder elite. The other interesting categories are actually sometimes it comes from the opposition, either in the form of opposition political parties or movements. But this is an interesting case because when it comes usually from the opposition or the opposition movements, resistance to inclusion represents a broad societal base and usually a very strong nationalistic constituency. So this has been the case in Sri Lanka with the Sinhalese nationalist groups and the protests they organize in Turkey's Kurdish process with the nationalist groups, ultra-nationalist groups. In Kyrgyzstan, another case I look at against the Uzbeks' inclusion and after the rise of the Kyrgyz Nationalist Party, which was in the opposition. So the government is trying to push for inclusion, but the resistance is coming from the broader societal opposition, which usually relies on an ideology and hierarchy-enhancing ideology. In Macedonia, again, similarly, inclusion of Albanians into this after the Ohrid peace agreement, it is, protests and has been quite violent. The other interesting category here is the armed groups' resistance to inclusion, which has been the case in about 13%. This is usually the case where there is more than one armed group, and one armed group does not want the participation of the other armed group. So it is mostly like competition among them. It is more limited, targeted in that sense, but it can, it can be a serious problem. All right. How much time? Okay. I'll just take a couple more minutes to talk about the motivation now. So I'm trying to give examples of motivation in three types of motivation as I observed, and I'm trying to give examples from different case studies in the report that I'm working on right now. So one of them is political motivation. I call it the political motivation, just like the political competition, rivalry, zero-sum thinking. If they're in there, we're not there, that kind of thing. And this has been very common in a lot of cases, like the armed group competition in Darfur, for example, negotiations there, it has been the case in Aceh, Tajikistan, etc. So it's very common. But these are usually more targeted. It's not pervasive really, okay, systemic. The second one is more like economic motivation, and I see this in a lot of the cases I look at from Latin America. So the resistance comes from the elite, the part of the elite that has very strong economic privileges in the system, and inclusion is seen as a threat. They see inclusion as a threat for losing their sort of privileged economic high-level status in the society. So one of the cases I study in depth is Guatemala, and looking into the role of this sort of landowning business elite, very powerful, the Coercive. And they boycotted all of the inclusive negotiations. They tried to sabotage the civil society forums, etc. They tried to do this together with the military. They tried in many different occasions and throughout the process and all that. And eventually, well, they couldn't succeed in actually the civil society making input into the negotiations, for example. That happened, but then they succeeded in the implementation phase in the referendum. They stopped the implementation of all the provisions in the peace agreement related to socioeconomic reforms, for instance. Okay, the last type, as I told you, is this the motivation is mostly, you know, ideological social dominance. So that there is this hierarchy enhancing ideology. It has been sort of adopted by the. It is closely connected to the dominant group identity, and favored institutionally. And in this case, inclusion is seen as an identity threat as well to the dominant group status, and that actually ideology that they identify themselves with. And it has been the case in a lot of cases: Nepal, Fiji, Sri Lanka, the Kurdish case, Burundi, Egypt. Against women, actually, this is against women's participation. This is also again a major motivation, etc. Okay, and oftentimes, actually, you also see a cocktail of all these taking place. Okay, I'm also thinking about some ways of addressing, like what strategies can be used to overcome, but I'm not going to talk about that now. It's a very sort of baby ideas there, but I'm thinking in line of more like, so what strategies can we think about for these different types of resistance? In the more pervasive, the more systemic institutional ones, in the two cases I'm looking at, what you see is like collective action movements actually emerging as another sort of backlash to that resistance. And in Guatemala, it has been more successful because they were able to gather a broader coalition between the indigenous and sort of urban parts of the society that were not happy about the implementation of the peace agreement. So it was more successful there. But in Nepal, the mass action sort of remained limited to an ethnic minority and isolated, turned into violence, and other they could not build this broader coalition even with the Maoists, and it did not really work there. They didn't get anything that they wanted at the end. But I'm also looking into what kinds of sort of things that can be done in the process design, decision-making rules and procedures. So to deal with the more like the direct, explicit types of resistance that I talked about. Okay, I'm going to finish here. There's a lot more that I can say, but I think you have enough.